Welcome to Sabby Sabs podcast. My special guest tonight is Margaret Kimberley. She is the executive editor and senior columnist of the Black Agenda Report, and she is the author of Prejudicial, Black America, and the Presidents. Margaret, thank you so much for coming on.
Thank you so much for having me. It's great to be here.
So, Margaret, I want to start off by talking about Joe Biden going into 2024. So far, Joe Biden has not said whether or not he's going to run. They are predicting he'll make that announcement in April. We'll see. But I want to get your opinion about how you feel about Joe Biden having a primary challenge. And I ask this question because obviously, I think all of us know by now, Marianne Williamson has announced she's going to primary challenge Joe Biden. And I just heard recently that Robert F. Kennedy Jr. is thinking about primary challenging Joe Biden as well. And I'm sure as the year goes on, more people may come forward. What is your take on this? Or do you even think that it's worth the time? And then I have a video announcement that I want to show as well.
Well, you know, the problem with these Democratic primary challenges is it's the problem my late colleague, Bruce Dixon, at Black Agenda Report described with Bernie Sanders, and he called it sheepdogging. And ultimately, a lot of these people, they're whatever, regardless of what they say, at the end of the day, they are going to sheepdog progressives back into the Democratic Party fold. So that, to me, is the biggest problem. Who is, if anyone who's been discussed, who's really serious about pushing the system, about taking on the Democratic Party establishment, the Democratic wing of the oligarchy. We have an oligarchy in this country. I don't even want to argue with people about that. So in order to get the things we need and we want, we have to be willing to fight. And if you have people, it's a vanity project, or they're only going to be in it for a while, or whatever their rationale, if they're really not ready to challenge Biden and the Democratic Party, that's the biggest problem. And that's something that progressives need to, I think, be most mindful of as these various people throw their hats in the ring.
I agree. So there is a clip here from Case Study QB. Shout out to Case for this clip, where they're actually talking about other politicians, more so even some of the progressives, and where they stand in reference to whether or not they're going to support Joe Biden if he were to run again in 2024. So I just want to play this clip really quick.
Democrats are putting on a united front to support President Joe Biden for a likely re-election bid. Despite questions about his age and his approval ratings in the low 40s, House Democrats agreed they're sticking with Biden during their annual retreat last week in Baltimore. The gathering included both progressives and moderates, along with leadership and rank-and-file members. Biden is already the oldest president in history at the age of 80. And if he runs and wins re-election next year, he would be 86 at the end of his second term. The president said he intends to run for that second term, but has not officially announced his candidacy. The official announcement is slated for the months ahead. Aides had been looking towards April, though there's some recent chatter that it may slip later into the year. For more on that, I'm joined by congressional reporter for The Hill, Michael Schnell. Michael, great to see you this morning. So you were talking to House Democrats who have made it clear that they are coalescing behind President Biden. And we're going to set aside Marianne Williamson. And at the moment, anyway, Biden seems to be unchallenged for the nomination. But dig a little deeper for us. How united are these Democrats really behind Biden? What are their concerns?
That's exactly right, Jonathan. House Democrats at their annual retreat in Baltimore last week, they met there in Baltimore, and there was one clear theme throughout that one of many clear themes throughout that three-day retreat was Biden 2024. House Democrats from all ends of their very diverse, politically diverse spectrum threw their support behind a Biden re-election campaign. And I'm talking about the center-left New Democratic Coalition, members of leadership, and also members of the Congressional Progressive Caucus. Chairwoman Chairwoman Pramila Jayapal, who I will note through her support behind Bernie Sanders in the 2020 presidential primary, she said that she would like to see President Biden announce his campaign sooner rather than later.
Okay, so according to her, even the so-called progressives in Congress, they've all got on board and decided to support Joe Biden in 2024. So I'm thinking back to when Bernie Sanders ran in 2020 and 2016, there were some of those progressives that did support Bernie Sanders. Like she mentioned, Pramila Jayapal was one of them.
Mhm.
But now even she has decided to support a corporate Democrat like Joe Biden. So my question is, if you do not have the support from the squad members or other so-called progressives in Congress, and you are challenging Joe Biden, or you say you're challenging him to his left,
Mhm.
is it even worth it? And how, and more so, how are you going to win if even the DSA politicians are not going to back you and they're going to back Joe Biden?
Well, that all of that is true. You know, he's the incumbent. So someone like Jayapal may have supported Sanders before, but now we have a Democratic incumbent, and that just increases the pressure of this dynamic that we've been discussing. It's hard for them not to back the sitting president, not to mention the fact that they never opposed him. What did they oppose? What did progressives in Congress do? What have they gotten done? I mean, I remember this disgraceful episode where they wrote this mealy-mouthed letter about Ukraine, fence-straddling letter, and they wouldn't stand by it for 24 hours. They condemned themselves the next day. So that's an example of what they've done. Did we get Build Back Better? No, we didn't. Is the child tax credit gone? Yes, it is. All of these things that they claim to want, we don't have anymore. So at the end of the day, they all fold up like cheap lawn chairs. I'd like to develop a meme of lawn chairs folding up, because that's what the progressives are really like. And, you know, when I hear about the retreat, there were moderates and progressives. They're all moderates. They're all, you know, the two parties in this country. We have a far right party and a center right party. And rarely do you get members who are willing to speak up against their leadership. So I think you will see some pretend opposition, some fake opposition, but ultimately some will be more supportive, some will be less. And of course he's going to run again. Why are they even talking about it? Why would they be discussing supporting Biden or not if he's not going to win? Nobody walks away. I can't think of a president who didn't run for re-election. The last one in my lifetime was Lyndon Johnson when I was a kid in 1968. He's the last one. Ever since then, they all run for re-election. I don't think Biden is going to be any different, but that is not a good thing for this country. I think his administration is very dangerous. I think what they've done with Ukraine, I mean, let's be clear, they blew up the Nord Stream pipeline. And nobody challenges them, by the way. So I feel as though they can do very desperate and dangerous things, and nobody's going to take them on. So I would love it if Joe Biden rode off into the sunset, but he's not going to. We're going to go through this again. And we see them, you know, I call them the Twitter warriors. Wouldn't it be great if you could put food on the table? Wouldn't it be great if you had something we have no intention of actually doing for you? And then they'll bring up Trump. It's Trump I feel like he's going to live forever, just as a way to shut people up. So that's what I think that we're going to have. Excuse me.
What do you think of this strategy of putting progressives in through the Democratic Party in general? This is something I'm sure you know that those of us at RBN are heavily against. We came from that Bernie Sanders movement. Some of us canvassed for Bernie Sanders. Some of us canvassed for members of the squad. I heavily supported Ayanna Pressley when she first ran. And I do feel like their rhetoric back then, when Trump was president, they were more bold, and I felt like they were more willing to fight back. But the moment that Joe Biden won, all of a sudden that they just became subdued, not willing to fight and push back against Joe Biden. What do you think of this strategy of putting progressives to the Democratic Party? Some people argue and say that it's worth it to at least get the message out. But then there are those of us that say, no, it's not worth it anymore. Stop taking money from working class people and let's try to do something different.
Yeah, I think we need to, if you look back in history, you will see that the greatest strides for the people were always made outside of the electoral system. So, for example, so Biden, walks across the Edmund Pettus Bridge over the weekend. I'm sick of these people who don't care, using the civil rights movement as some kind of backdrop. I mean, what has he done to get the Voting Rights Act reenacted so that it's meaningful again? He hasn't done anything, but they use Black people, they use the civil rights movement as this high watermark. But the thing I think we need to remember about the civil rights movement is that people engaged in mass action, and they made demands that they knew the powerful did not want to meet, and they made them anyway. And that is what any gains that were made, the Civil Rights Act, Voting Rights Act, the EPA, Nixon created the EPA. Why? Because there was a huge environmental movement, and they actually targeted some Republicans for defeat. So this Republican conservative president is the one who started the EPA because he was forced to do it. And I think we have to stop thinking only in terms of electoral politics, because it's going to be everything that we've been talking about, this vicious circle of dashed hopes, and maybe this time is better. And well, actually, what about Trump? It's always going to be something, some reason why we can't have the things that we know we need, that we know that we want. So it's movement politics that has to be brought back, because that's what does it. That's when we get action. You have to have politicians who frankly are afraid of the people, and they're not afraid. Why should they be afraid of us? They've got no reason to be afraid. They don't do what we want, and we keep voting for them. So that is what we have to talk about doing. And it's not an easy thing. I don't even have all the answers, but we at least need to start with the questions, or pointing out things that we have seen happen over and over again. We've got to build a mass movement, the kind that, I'm old enough to remember when those things happened. But that is clear. That's what we have to have, and not this quadrennial hoax. I feel like, the last thing I want to do is watch another U.S. presidential election. It's frankly depressing. It's depressing me already. It didn't even start yet. So that we must end the dependence on electoral politics and go back to movement politics.
Yes, you bring up a good point in reference to the civil rights movement, because I do hear people mention this a lot. And they compare it to electoral politics. But I think what's important for people to understand is that the civil rights movement was not done through electoral politics. It was done completely on the outside. And I think people have to understand that those actions that they had started locally, and then it spread. So it took some time, but they put in the work to get it there. I was talking to Claire Daly recently, and I did ask her, like, how are you able to get thousands of people out in the streets in Europe? 50,000 people in Denmark, 50,000 people in Germany protesting against NATO. And she said, well, the difference is the politicians that we have in the EU that people elect are also involved on the movements on the outside. And that's the piece that we're missing. Like, none of the politicians, like when you look at the squad members, Cori Bush came from the Ferguson activism. She came from that. But the moment she stepped foot in DC, it was just like, I don't want to deal with this. We had the marches, Medicare for All, 2 years ago in this country, 50 cities. And she came to the DC march. She was the only politician that showed up. But when she showed up, she said, we don't appreciate what you guys are doing here. Now, let's remember, they ran on Medicare for All. So it's like, it's nice that you came to the protest, to the rally, but you came there and you came there salty, just to push back at people and to say, we don't appreciate what you guys are doing. So it seems like to me, they get into DC, all the activism that they did before they were elected, it's just done, or it's co-opted by the Democratic Party, and they're not involved in helping the movements on the outside. And I know that they would be a tremendous help to us. If we had squad members that came to those rallies, that came to anti-war rallies, we would have people out by the thousands and in the streets, but they won't even tweet about it. And so for me to hear someone like Bernie Sanders recently in an interview make excuses for Joe Biden, make excuses for NATO, and for giving billions of dollars to Ukraine, they have really lost the plot. And sometimes I wonder if this was the plan all along. Like, do you ever wonder that? Do you wonder, were they planning to not fight for us, or were they planning to fight for us? And then once they got in, they realized they weren't going to be able to push back on Democratic leadership.
I think if you're talking about individuals, I'm sure it's some of both. I'm sure there were people who were idealistic until they got to Washington and they, got their minds right and were pressured into changing. And then I think some of them are cynics, and they know that in certain districts you get elected by claiming to be a progressive. And that's how you win the seat, by claiming to be a progressive, whether you really are or not. What we don't have are people who are really revolutionary, who would not be afraid to lose. So yes, it's true. If you stood up publicly against the Democratic Party oligarchy, they would raise money and make sure you had a well-funded opponent. They would do that. But if you had the kind of movement that I see, that I imagine, somebody else would run. It would be okay if this or that person lost. There'd be someone in their place. There would be a movement that made them think twice before they tried to replace someone that was popular. You'd have a movement that would undo the impact of money. But without that, we get they're just fakers is all they are. And ultimately, it doesn't matter whether they were cynical or whether they were idealistic and they beat it out of them. It doesn't really matter. At the end of the day, they're not serving the people. They're not serving our needs. And it's especially sad for Black people to me, because Black politics now amounts to little more than keeping Republicans out of office. That's it. And we're, constantly intimidated. Well, you don't want Trump to win. You don't want so-and-so to win. We've got to stop falling for that. So what do we have under Biden? He still owes everybody $600. Remember that? Yep. We were going to get 2,000, and it was like, well, you got 600 and plus 1,400. So you kind of got to, your $2,000. The COVID programs are ending. Child tax credit, SNAP benefits. Some states undid the unemployment extension, and the Democrats did nothing to get people. I find it hard to believe they couldn't have figured out a way to get people their money directly, but they didn't care. And we're going to be in this situation as long as we keep following these people. I mean, what's the definition of insanity? Doing the same thing but expecting a different result. And I would rather not be insane and keep doing the same things and we end up with Cori Bush. I mean, how insulting. She would have been better off not showing up. So she showed up and then put people on blast. I mean, really, that's what you get? So why would it be so horrible if she wasn't in Congress? Why would it be so horrible if Joe Biden wasn't the president? What do we have because he's president? We're on the brink of nuclear war. I have no faith in him and his team. I think they are all obsessive. They're all fanatics about doing things they can't do. And you notice they're now trying to start a war with China. So Ukraine blows up in their faces in their misguided effort to contain Russia. Now they're trying to contain China. They cannot undo China's economic prowess. They cannot. All they can do is, did you see this story about They think first it was a weather balloon, then it's TikTok. Now it's a crane. They think cranes from China are spying on us. I mean, it's just insane. And they make up this story about, we think we have some confidence that we think that China might be considering giving weapons to Russia. They just made it up. And so these people are very dangerous. I find it hard to believe that we could be, how much worse off could we be with the Republican? I mean, look at this Buttigieg. What does he do? I mean, the Southwest Airlines meltdown over the holiday season, thousands of people stranded. They stranded their own flight crews with whatever it was that went wrong. And all he does is talk about what he can't do. He's the one person in the country who can do something about these airlines. The East Palestine, Ohio, the train derailment, the dangerous chemicals. He only showed up because Trump went. How did Trump go before he went? So, why would it be any worse? It's like Trump undid these regulations, but Biden didn't undo what Trump did, and he has the power to do it. So we have to stop being afraid. I guess that's the one thing I would say, and see the system for what it is, what it does, what it doesn't do. And when you see what it doesn't do, then I think you're less afraid to step outside of this box they try to put us in.
Agreed. Shama Sawant actually recently launched Worker Strike Back. I'm not sure if you heard about that, but this is a organization where she's trying to organize the workers nationally. So across the United States, one of their first main objectives is actually to unionize Amazon all across the U.S. And I think, that's something that I think Chris Smalls and the rest of them, ALU, could use some help with. Like, they can't just do it all by themselves. But I noticed something. So that launch was announced on Saturday, and that was also the same day that Marianne Williamson announced her run for presidency, although it came out a couple days before that, but she had her speech that Saturday. And I think what was really disappointing to me is that more people were focused on that instead of focusing on Shama Sawant's launch of Worker Strike Back. Even people who say they care about labor, they care about the workers, they haven't mentioned this at all. And it's very, I don't know if I want to say suspect. I'll just say odd. It's very odd to me, Margaret, because how can you say that you care about labor and you care about workers' rights, but here is this organization that's launching by someone who I think is very prominently known, even though she's a city councilor, and you don't even mention it. So what frustrated me is that everybody was talking about Marianne Williamson on Saturday. Meanwhile, Worker Strike Back gets kind of buried in the algorithm. And I feel like we need to be focusing on organizing the workers and helping people who are part of the working class. And I honestly just don't feel like trying to put our money and our resources into another political campaign. I don't feel like that is the answer, because the workers in the end still get screwed. And I want to get your opinion about that in reference to how we should organize.
Well, that goes back to what we're talking about, where people are fixated on electoral politics. So every time someone throws their hat in the ring, that's going to be the news story. And we also have corporate media that is a mouthpiece for the state. That's a mouthpiece, in this case, for the Biden administration. So they are not predisposed to even look for these stories and find out what else is going on, because that's not what their bosses want them to do. And so this fixation on electoral politics. So Marianne Williamson is the hot item on the news, and not that there's an effort to organize workers, to organize all the Amazon workers. The Amazon business model, it's horrific. They have more injuries than other warehouse workers. They don't want to keep them as workers. And in some places, they want to churn them out, like, in a fast food restaurant or something. In some places, they've run out of people to hire. They've done that to such a degree. So I think it's very important to help those folks. The Starbucks workers, they'll close the store if their workers vote to unionize. And we have to be thinking about and studying ways to fight back. and not to focus on Marianne Williamson, who's not going to be the Democratic Party nominee anyway, and who doesn't represent anything different that we've been talking about. So it's the dependence on electoral politics, a kind of celebrity culture, who's in the news, who's going to run, and not an emphasis on organizing working people, because working people are suffering. The minimum wage it's disgusting that it's so small. The fight for what is $15 an hour? If here in New York City, the minimum is $15 an hour. You can't rent an apartment with that. You have to have, I don't know how many roommates or a spouse who makes a whole lot more in order to survive on that kind of money. How are we not talking about that? How are we not making that our focus? And it's the drive to unionize, I think, that is a big part of what we should be working on in order to improve people's lives. But, you can't worry about Marianne Williamson or anybody else saying they're going to run against Joe Biden, and they're probably sheepdogs anyway, but nobody has made any effort to continue that success that, as you say, that Chris Smalls began with his union win here in New York.
Well said. I want to pivot to student loan debt cancellation, because this is a hot topic again. We tried to tell people a couple months ago, when Joe Biden announced that he was going to cancel $10,000 student loan debt and $20,000 for those who were Pell Grant recipients. I tried to tell people back then that, number one, he didn't do it the right way. And two, most of this money was going to go to the interest. And recently, Imani Oakley just put out a video on Twitter where she actually called the student loan organization, and they actually verified that yes, well, that money is going to be going to the interest. So you'll still have your balance. And it's just little things like this that are not mentioned to the American people. So you had a large amount of Gen Z voters come out and support Democrats during the midterms for two reasons. One was student loan debt cancellation, and the other one was to codify Roe v. Wade into law. And then immediately when the midterm results were announced for that week, boom, struck down by a federal judge, which we had been warned that this could happen because it wasn't done the right way. He was supposed to do it through the Higher Education Act of 1965. He chose to do it through the HEROES Act. And here we are now with the Supreme Court. So it's in their hands, so to speak. What do you think is going to happen if the Supreme Court does not vote to uphold the student loan debt cancellation?
Well, first of all, we shouldn't be surprised. What did Joe Biden say about student loan debt when he was running? Remember, he said something, it was terrible. It's like, I don't have any sympathy for young people, something along those lines. He didn't care. He said so. And he was pushed into this little step. He did all kinds of phony things right before the midterms, student loan debt, the pardons for marijuana possession, which, by the way, freed no one from jail. They haven't even put the pardon program into place so that people can get those few people whom it applies to can actually get the pardon. And they know, and that's the insidious thing. They know what people want. They know what people need. He was pushed into it. He was hoping that it would help them in the midterms. So, and it was 10, 20,000. I mean, I know for some people who may have gone to a trade school or something, that may have actually helped them. But if you got a bachelor's degree and a graduate degree, this is nothing for you. I mean, I know people who went to public colleges, so it wouldn't cost so much. And there's still $40,000, $50,000, $60,000 in debt. There's $1.9 trillion in debt, student loan debt. And so we have this president who told you he didn't care. So he would, come up with some gimmick before the midterms to fool you into thinking he was serious. And now, of course, and they know what's going to happen. He's not dumb. They know what the Supreme Court the conservative majority is going to do. So they're just going to point and say, well, what can we do? It's those conservatives in the Supreme Court, and help us get more Democrats in the Senate, because then we can get some judicial appointments and, something like that. So this is a classic example of the bait and switch that we have been subjected to, which I believe makes the case for putting electoral politics aside altogether. When you think back to those days that I'm talking about, the days of the liberation movement, the civil rights movement, people were in motion all over the country. I mean, thousands of, and it's a friend of mine used to say that Black people in the South got everybody the right to vote when they couldn't vote. But that's the power of that kind of action, and you are not going to get it in electoral politics. So, of course, this measly student loan debt relief isn't going to happen at all.
No. Do you think that'll be enough to wake up Democrat voters and to push them, so to speak, not to, or to say, listen, I'm going to withhold my vote because you didn't fulfill your promise about student loan debt? Or do you think people will still just fall for it because of the fear mongering about Trump?
I still think the fear mongering will take hold. Trump is like this, it's like if he didn't exist, they would have to invent him. He's like this all-purpose boogeyman that they, and of course he's running again. So that even makes their job. I'm sure Democrats are happy that he's running again, because they can keep using him to frighten people into acting against their own interests. I think we need some, old-fashioned political education in this country. I think we need like history lessons. We need to remember what did work, what didn't work in the past, so that we're not just jerked around every 4 years by these people who are just dismissive of us, just disdainful of us, that they don't care. They know people are struggling and they just don't care, because they ultimately, they don't answer to us. They answer to the oligarchy. And as long as that's true, you can vote till you vote blue, no matter who, vote till you're blue in the face, and we will end up with the same results.
This is something I've been informing people about as well, in reference to like corporations. I remember very distinctively Bernie Sanders calling out certain billionaires. Like he would call out Jeff Bezos, he would call out Elon Musk, but I feel like those are the easy targets. We all know that they're super rich. Yeah. But I wouldn't hear Bernie Sanders call out BlackRock. I wouldn't hear him call out Larry Fink. And BlackRock owns the world. They own the media. They own so much. And I'm curious, why do you think that is? Why do you think there were certain people that I don't know if he did it on purpose or not, but certain people that he would not call out at all, and just calling out the obvious targets, so to speak?
Well, it's part of that celebrity culture. Those are people that everyone's heard of, So if you talk about, what did you say? The billionaires is, that's my Bernie impersonation, that people are familiar with, and not about the system. Bernie ultimately was a reformer. And I think he, does want some kind of reform. But what that means is you're not going to call out the ruling class. Let's call it what it is. BlackRock, by the way, they're in Ukraine. They're going to help the Ukrainian government, which I'm like, oh, really? So money's involved. So it's not about democracy for the poor Ukrainians. Anyway. But it's the system that's not going to allow it. They will not allow the tiny, or they will allow something tiny, I think the price of insulin is going down for people on Medicare, and I'm glad for them, but we still have a healthcare system in the hands of big corporations. That's the problem. And as long as we have these politicians who won't really call about the system, who aren't, as I said, aren't really revolutionary, we're going to see the same thing. I mean, look at what they did to Bernie. Even though he's just a reformer, a would-be, reformer, he was just not acceptable. I mean, look at the lengths they went to to make sure he did not get the nomination, the way they cheated him in Iowa. The second time they cheated him. And he goes along and he would say, "Oh, I like Joe. I think he can." I was like, "Are you running against him or not? I think Joe can win." Oh God! But so that's why they have nothing. Well, they do fear. They fear even little changes. They feared having someone who might possibly energize people to demand some small changes. And they don't want that. They're like, y'all have to just live like dogs. That's what we've decided. And you may get a crumb every now and again, but the crumbs are going to be few and far between. And the Bernie Sanders of the world, ultimately they go along with that. And it doesn't matter if they want something different. I'm sure Bernie Sanders would like a different kind of country. I'm sure he would, but it doesn't really matter if he's not going to fight for it. And as far as electoral politics is concerned, we need somebody to run independently, not to run as a Democrat. That is something that would really could potentially upend the system. I'm a registered Green Party member, although the New York State Legislature stole our ballot line. That's a whole other story. But we need to support people who aren't Democrats at all. We really have to go for broke, because this business of thinking your problems are solved because you got a Democrat in the White House. I remember the day, it was a few days after Election Day in 2020, when it was official, or the media said it was official, that Biden had enough electoral votes. And people were partying in the streets. Here in New York, it was, I was so annoyed I didn't even go outside. I'd never seen anything like it. And I was like, what were we partying? What were people doing? What was the big deal about having this man? If you looked at his career, you knew he didn't want to do anything for the people. He was always a conservative Democrat. But we've got to say no more. We have to say no more to these people, and even to some of the people who claim they're going to fight them, when we know they don't really mean it.
Well said. One thing I want to talk about really quickly is building an anti-war movement. So this is something that I have noticed when I look back in history and I look at the Vietnam War protests, thousands of people out in the streets. And I know there were two things that were different back then. There was the draft, so it affected more people. And then two, mainstream media actually showed civilian casualties in Vietnam on television, which I never saw in my lifetime with any of the wars that happened since I've been alive. So I think the American people have been shielded, so to speak, to see how many people are actually dying in these wars that are not fighting in these wars, including children. And then also, we don't have the draft. So when I was growing up, there were more people that were in the military. My dad was in the military. There was a whole community of military people. Now, I don't know anybody in the military. It's kind of hard to find someone that is attached to it, so to speak. But what I have noticed is that even trying to mobilize people just to come to anti-war rallies, which I'm going to show one of them in just a second, it's very difficult and very hard. I think a lot of Americans have been propagandized. They just believe what they hear on mainstream media in reference at least to this war between Russia and Ukraine. They're not even knowledgeable about some of the attacks that have happened in Syria. They're not aware of the drone strikes that have happened in Somalia. When I talk to them about Yemen, they don't even know these things are happening. It's like, it's not even being covered on mainstream media. And so that's a big part of the problem. But how do you think we mobilize people to start an anti-war movement again in this country?
Well, it's funny what you said about the draft. I know some people on the left who say we should have a draft again, because as you point out, that would, everybody would have skin in the game. Everybody would be concerned. I don't think it would quite work that way. That's my first argument against it. But the other thing they've done since Iraq, there were huge, and now it's about to be the 20th anniversary of the U.S. invasion of Iraq. That brought people out in the street. But if you take out the equation of Americans dying, fewer people care. So ever since Iraq, they have had proxy wars. They have used sanctions. They use old-fashioned coups and interfering. Look at what they did in Ukraine. They got Ukrainian fascists to take over the government there. They've gotten jihadists and to destroy Libya, tried to do the same thing to Syria, use Ukraine as a proxy against Russia. Now they're trying to use Taiwan as a proxy against China. So they know that the thing that people hate the most is the idea of Americans dying in some foreign land. So they make sure that doesn't happen anymore. And as you point out with the corporate media, there was a time when occasionally they would tell you something the state didn't want you to know. And you're right about Vietnam. They talked about Walter Cronkite and how people trusted him so much. And if he questioned Vietnam, then, that was a big problem for them. That doesn't happen now. The Pentagon Papers, Daniel Ellsberg's expose, that would not happen now. The New York Times and the Washington Post, they're not exposing anything the Biden administration doesn't want you to know. And their reporting on Ukraine is horrible. I mean, it's horrible. They have the week before the first anniversary, New York Times editorial board. I mean, it was just Putin's evil. That's all you need to know. Russia's lying about everything. NATO only expanded because everybody was scared of Russia. And that's it. That's all. There's nothing else for you to know. I mean, it was dreadful. And that's the kind of so-called reporting that we get in corporate media. So people don't know enough. You really have to be interested. And it's a very dangerous thing, I think, that you have to be predisposed to want this information, to seek it out. And if you don't, then you're, maybe, excuse me, I believe that most people probably don't want $100 billion to go to Ukraine. I think that's something you would not have to convince people of. It's something that, of course, because we have no representation in Congress, it's not anything anybody acts on. But I think most people say, why don't we have things in this country? Why didn't we get that extra $600? What about the student loan debt? All the things that we've talked about. If the average person had their way, Ukraine would not be getting any more money. I'm convinced of that. Mm-hmm. But beyond that, there's very limited understanding of what these wars mean, what they do to the whole the suffering they cause in the rest of the world, or even with the military, that we have this poverty draft. I mean, and you're right. There was a time when most men had been in the military, but that's a long time ago now. And it's something that doesn't touch people's lives. And now they've made sure that even that small group of people in the military are stateside, or maybe they're in a base in a foreign country, but they're not in danger on a battlefield somewhere. So we are up against it. But when there are these protests, we have to talk about them and promote them as much as we can, because there are people who they may appear to be uninterested, but if someone says to them, here's an opportunity to register your opposition, they will participate. Of course, that's why they don't give you that information, because they know that's true. So as difficult as it may be, I'm a member of Black Alliance for Peace, and I'm a member of the United National Anti-War Coalition. I believe very, very strongly in organizing. You have to join an organization, and we are building, and we are getting people out there. And we have to talk about how to strategize to make these manifestations count, to move the needle, so to speak. But I think it's very, very important, and I support all of these efforts to register our opposition to what the U.S. does around the world.
And in reference to organizing, especially with something that's like for like anti-war, do you feel there should be red lines? And I ask because there was a rally recently, Rage Against the War Machine in DC. I was at the rally. I felt like a Rachel Maddow's reporting of the rally was very off, way off. Of course, it's Rachel Maddow.
Yeah.
I do know that there were, some people who didn't feel comfortable going to that rally. I actually, I went to the rally. I had no problems. But do you feel there should be red lines? Because some people felt like they shouldn't go to a rally if there's going to be a speaker there that may be libertarian, or a speaker there that may be conservative, or a speaker that may have said concerning things about like different communities, like LGBTQ communities and things like that. Where do you feel people should draw that line?
Well, to your point, people drew lines all over the place. I did not participate. The organizations I just mentioned didn't participate, but we weren't asked to as well. I think, but there were people I respect who did participate, and I still respect them. I'm not planning to fall out with anybody because they went to or spoke at Rage Against the War Machine. But I think what this points out is we have to build the movement. And the fact that there could be a credible march with, for example, libertarians. So yes, they are opposed to a lot of military spending. Yes, they are. But they're also opposed to government spending in general. So a lot of the things we've talked about, they're not in favor of. So I think we have to ask ourselves after this event is over, are these people you can work with? Are these organizations you can work with? Do you have the same ideology? And you have to ask yourselves, well, how do libertarians move the needle in the anti-war movement? And I think some of the arguments were, I think, not accurate. So, for example, we were told, well, if you want to reach working class white people, you have to have conservatives involved. Well, first of all, who says working class white people are all right wing? I don't think that's true. So I think that you have to stop and examine some of the suppositions being made that allowed this to move forward. I remember when I first heard about it, I just hadn't heard there were some individuals speaking. Am I frozen? I think I froze. Again. Okay, cool. There were some individuals speak. I just had not heard of these organizations. I hadn't heard of some of the people, which does not mean it's something not to join with. But I think I fall more on the side of having those lines and making sure that we build the left, that we build the anti-war left, that we build anti-imperialism. I think that should be our emphasis, rather than getting sidetracked by who's at this rally, who's at that rally. Can we be with those people? I have to say that, if you're going to, if not change your own politics, but coalesce with people who have very different politics, it's got to be for a better reason than a specious argument about, working class people being libertarians. I'm not even sure that that's the case. But I think one of the problems, it was clear to me that the organizers did not know how to organize. I mean, I think they made some mistakes that were caused by the fact that they don't have these relationships. Like they invited individuals, some individuals who they knew might draw a bigger crowd, but they did not reach out to some of the groups I've mentioned and others. So that you can have a real movement that's actually going to accomplish something. So having said all of those things, I believe we've got to work with people who are on board with ending these wars, stop stealing our money to go overseas, to use it for human needs here. So that's why, for me, I can't, if someone says, oh, I'm against $100 billion going to Ukraine, but I also think we don't need Medicare for all, that for me is not going to work. I'm not going to hate that person or hate anybody who did participate. But I think the lesson we to take from all of this is to build amongst ourselves. We've got to build. And then I believe we'll be less likely to have these fights that are not productive, that don't go anywhere, because I don't know how many people were reached. I mean, and how do you determine a successful protest? Is it the number of people? That can be part of it. But did you get people who weren't involved before? Do you have a strategy for how to approach elected officials? Do you have a strategy for dealing with the media? Do you have a strategy for educating people? I mean, these are very big questions, and I'm not saying people have to have all of them answered in order to take any action, but I want us to be focused on a bigger picture. And I think if we do that, we will go a long way towards building the movement against these wars.
I think for me, some of the things that I've seen been in organizing spaces, I've seen this with every event. I think this is the thing, like when we did the Marches for Medicare for All, that event was heavily smeared. Some people didn't like that some of the speakers were conservative. There was a conservative speaker who was a doctor who agreed with Medicare for All, didn't agree with other issues that we push for on the left, but he said Medicare for All is a no-brainer and we should have it in this country. So that's an event that was heavily smeared. I've seen the Julian Assange event was also smeared. And it's just like, it seems like to me, sometimes it kind of comes across as, and I totally understand if someone tells me like, that's not for me, I don't feel comfortable coming to that, that's their right and their decision. But I think it becomes a little bit strange when I see people online trying to smear an event and tell people don't go, don't go, don't go. Then it just kind of seems like, okay, what's your angle here? And I saw that with like multiple events that I've been a part of. I think when I look at like an anti-war movement and I'm looking at getting numbers out and people out in the streets, the 50,000 people that show up in Denmark and that show up in Germany, they're not all on the left, but they're all against this war and they're all upset with NATO. So I think that's something we have to ask. Like, even if we look back at the Vietnam protests that happened back then, was every protester like out on the streets? Were they all like on the left? I don't think so. So I think I get where you're coming from. For me, I kind of, when I'm looking at organizing, I organize with people around the issues. And then I know there's certain people that I can work with on certain issues. So like the George Floyd protest, for example, I know what groups to go to for that. I knew where to go. Even some of those people didn't agree with me on Medicare for all. They were not for that at all. In fact, a lot of them were liberals. They were just like, we do not want government-run healthcare. When I looked at the Julian Assange event, I organized with people that are passionate about against censorship and for free press. So I know where to go with. And I think that's the thing for me, is that I've never been able to find one particular group that agrees with me on every single issue when it comes to organizing.
I think, one of the problems that I think you're pointing out, there's a lot of people who are just unserious to spend time online worrying about what somebody else chose to do, or making up a specious argument. That's not where I put my efforts. I'll put it that way. The problem with somebody like Julian Assange is the propaganda has worked. I mean, it's terrible what the lies they told about him. It's like, well, Trump won because of Julian Assange. Not that Trump got $4 billion, the equivalent of $4 billion in free advertising from corporate media, but it's Julian Assange, and he, the Russians gave him something, and in fact, somebody leaked something to him. It's a longer story, but that lack of information, that plays a role when we try to move, that people will bring in all kinds of irrelevancies. But I would say in general, you have to. I believe it's important to have an ideology behind what we do. So if someone is I don't know who this person was who spoke at the Medicare for All rally.
Oh,
But
Dr. Joseph Jarvis.
okay, I don't know the name, sorry, but if the point should be that this is a public good. Healthcare is a public good. It should be a right. So it seems to me that if you're asserting that healthcare should be a right, it should be in public hands, as it is all over the world. And it should not be in private hands. It should be not just Medicare for all, but it should be run by us. And I think when you say something as an example, when you say that, but you have to reach that point. It's not just about how much a particular person spends on their health care. And that is a heavier lift to get people to think beyond that, because we're trained to, in this country, we're, encouraged to believe in irrelevancies and in a lot of foolishness. So it can be difficult. I'm not saying that it isn't, but I think when you have that ideology that you hold on to, I think you're less likely to get tripped up by this. So I'm not just personally, I'm not just against the proxy war in Ukraine. If it were up to me, the defense budget would be cut in half. The U.S. would not be interfering in the affairs of other nations. That money that would be cut from the defense budget would be used for us, because we would have healthcare as a right. We would have housing as a right. We wouldn't have homeless encampments everywhere. And when you organize around those principles, and when you have those strong principles, I think it's a lot less likely that you'll be tripped up by some of the things that happened, especially with that particular event. And it can be okay that everybody's not at the same thing. I don't think we should be afraid of that. It's like, listen, if libertarians want to campaign against the military budget that we have at it, go for it. But then, of course, when we talk about what that money should be used for, and that is the problem, that is the elephant in the room that can't be ignored, because on some issues, they are, we're going to be opposed to each other.
You should talk to Larry Sharpe about this, Margaret. Have you spoken to him before?
No.
Larry Sharpe, he's in New York with you. He was trying to run as governor of New York. As a libertarian, he was about to get on the ballot, then they prevented him from being on the ballot. It's the whole thing that went into that. But Larry Sharpe, he brought us on from RBN, and that was a wild time. But but we agree with him on some issues, and then other issues we were like, no, what are you talking about?
Yeah. Well, the New York State legislature kicked the libertarians. They lost their ballot line the same way the Greens did. Basically, they lifted the threshold a lot. Just get signatures to get a certain percentage of the vote in order to have a ballot line. And for the first time in my lifetime, only Democrats and Republicans are on the ballot in New York State. They have the Working Families Party, though, as Democrats. I don't consider them a different party, but the Greens had a ballot line, Libertarians had a ballot line. There were a couple other small parties, but the oligarchy in New York State did us all in.
Oh boy. Well, Margaret, I want to be respectful of your time. I just want to shout this out really quick, because there is another rally that's coming up in DC. It's called Peace in Ukraine. Join Peace in Ukraine rallies nationwide. That is March 18th through the 19th, DC at the White House. So that'll be at 1 p.m. Code Pink is sponsoring this, along with Answer Coalition and the People's Forum.
Yeah. And we have Black Alliance for Peace is endorsing, UNAC's endorsing. I think Vets for Peace are endorsing. It's a big coalition. It's a very big coalition. I don't know if you're going to be there, but I'm going to be there. And I'm looking for, it's been a while since with COVID, I feel like everything, sort of stopped, but I am going to get on a bus and get down to Washington. Thank you so much.
Awesome. Margaret, thank you so much for coming on tonight.
Thank you so much. It's been a pleasure. It's been fun.
Awesome. Talk to you later.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
All right, guys, that was Miss Margaret Kimberley. Always great to talk to her. I'm going to go to some of the comments here. Brent says, I love Margaret's tone of impatience with useless strategies. Yes, yes. What's going on? Casey says, hashtag workers strike back. Thank you so much for the super chat, Jonas. Great interview, questions, and discussion. Thank you so much, Jonas. And Pachico says, Sabby's discussions with Margaret are always excellent. Thanks, y'all. Thank you so much.